Two babies were born in Manhattan 8 days apart in November 1912. One would inherit a fortune built on nickel and dime stores. The other would inherit a fortune built on cigarettes. By the time they turned 18, both girls were richer than most countries, richer than they could spend in a lifetime even if they'd tried, and both of them tried. They shared a birth month, a social circuit, a set of newspaper columnists who covered their every move, and eventually, astonishingly, a husband. He married one of them, took what he wanted, and left. Then, years later, he married the other one, and did it again. This is the story of Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton, the two richest women of their generation, and the rivalry that outlasted every single marriage either of them ever entered. If you're new here, we cover the marriages, feuds, and slow-motion collapses of the 20th century's richest women, the ones the tabloids couldn't stop writing about, and history has mostly forgotten. Hit subscribe before we get into this one, because the ending involves a stolen husband, two military bomber planes handed out as parting gifts, and one very expensive act of revenge that neither woman ever admitted to planning. Barbara Woolworth Hutton arrived first, on November 14, 1912. Her grandfather was Frank Winfield Woolworth, the man who worked out that Americans would buy almost anything as long as it cost a nickel or a dime, and sat within reach of the front door. By 1919, Woolworths had grown into a chain of over 1,000 stores across the country, and the family that ran it had become one of the wealthiest in America, without anyone outside the business pages paying much attention. That changed for Barbara fast. Her mother, Edna Woolworth, died when Barbara was 5, an apparent suicide that the family spent decades trying to keep out of print. Her father, Franklin Hutton, a Wall Street broker, effectively handed his daughter off to nannies, governesses, and eventually her grandparents, and was rarely present for any of it. By the time Barbara turned 12, her grandmother had died too, and she became heir to 1/3 of the Woolworth fortune outright. The newspapers had a nickname for her before she'd finished growing up. Poor little rich girl. Money in one hand, nobody who particularly wanted her in the other. Years later, asked about the label, Hutton said something that got quoted in nearly every obituary written about her, that money alone couldn't buy happiness, but that in her case, it hadn't exactly bought misery either. Whether she believed that by the end of her life is a separate question. Doris Duke showed up 8 days later, on November 22, a few blocks away, in spirit if not quite in geography. Her father was James Buchanan Duke, the tobacco magnate who built the American Tobacco Company into a monopoly so complete that the federal government eventually dismantled it under antitrust law. Duke had made his fortune in cigarettes, then poured a second fortune into hydroelectric power and, later, into a university in North Carolina that took his name. When he died in 1925, Doris was 12 years old. He left her almost the entirety of an estate worth somewhere between $60 and $100 million, an amount that made 12-year-old Doris, by most reckonings, the richest child in the United States. Her mother, Nanaline, received only a modest trust by comparison, which tells you something about how deliberately the will was constructed. Before he died, James Buchanan Duke gave his daughter one instruction, and it's the line that follows her through every biography written since: trust no one. She appears to have taken it seriously for the rest of her life, sometimes to her benefit, and sometimes very much not. So picture the situation. Two girls, born 8 days apart, both suddenly the richest people most adults in America would ever personally meet, both effectively fatherless, both raised more by trustees and hired staff than by parents, both about to inherit more money than either of them could reasonably understand at that age. The press did what the press always does with a coincidence this convenient. They paired the girls off. One paper dubbed them the Gold Dust Twins, and the label stuck for 60 years. through 7 marriages on one side and 2 on the other, even though neither woman had asked for the comparison and neither one particularly enjoyed it. For a while, they actually got along. As young teenagers, they moved through the same narrow circuit of debutante events and European finishing schools, and by most accounts of people who knew them both, they were friendly, or at least as friendly as 2 only children raised inside that much isolation could manage to be. Barbara was sent to Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut. By her classmates' accounts, she was shy there, self-conscious about her weight, uncomfortable in a body that never seemed to match how the newspapers described her. Doris went to Brearley in Manhattan and came out of it more confident, more athletic, and, at nearly 6 feet tall, physically towering over most people in any room she walked into, Barbara included. In August of 1930, Doris threw her coming-out ball at Rough Point, her family's mansion in Newport. Barbara was one of roughly 600 guests. The Depression was not quite a year old at that point. A few miles away, men were selling apples on street corners to survive. Neither girl seems to have registered the contrast in any way that changed her behavior, and if she did, it didn't stop the party. Barbara threw her own debut that same year, and hers became one of the more notorious parties of the era, for precisely the reason you'd expect. Bread lines outside, imported champagne inside, a guest list stacked with European titles who'd crossed an ocean for the free food. The press had already decided what kind of story this was going to be, and Barbara's ball simply handed them their opening scene, one they'd keep writing variations of for the next 5 decades. From there, the 2 women's paths ran parallel without ever quite touching. Both were rich past any ordinary sense of the word. Both were surrounded by an entourage whose actual job, underneath the job titles, was managing that money and skimming a comfortable living from proximity to it. And both were about to discover the same uncomfortable fact about the world they'd been born into. A wedding in their circle wasn't really a wedding. It was a transaction that happened to include a ceremony. Barbara went first, as she generally did. In 1933, she married Alexis Medivani, a self-declared Georgian prince from a family so practiced at marrying into fortunes that his siblings had earned the nickname the Marrying Medivanis in the European press before Barbara ever met him. He spent freely and fast. The marriage lasted 2 years and ended the way most of Barbara's marriages would eventually end, with a settlement, a fresh round of headlines, and Barbara somewhat poorer in spirit if not yet in bank balance. Her second marriage, in 1935, was to Count Kurt von Haugwitz Hardenberg Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat. That marriage gave her the one thing that would matter most to her out of all 7 unions she'd eventually enter, her son Lance, born in February 1936. It also gave her, according to later accounts from people close to her, physical abuse behind closed doors, and a husband so preoccupied with shielding her fortune from American taxation that he talked her into signing what was later called an oath of renunciation, formally giving up her United States citizenship. She spent years afterward trying to walk that decision back, and the American press never entirely forgave her for it, treating the renunciation as proof that she'd stopped thinking of herself as one of them. The marriage effectively ended in 1938, was finalized in divorce by 1941, and it cost her custody arrangements that kept Lance largely in his father's care for years afterward. A separation, friends said, devastated her more than any divorce settlement ever could. There's a smaller story from inside that Reventlow marriage worth pausing on, because it says something about how Barbara's husbands tended to operate around her. The oath of renunciation wasn't just paperwork. It meant that for years, one of the wealthiest women born on American soil legally wasn't American at all, a fact newspapers brought up constantly, usually as evidence that she'd grown too foreign, too detached, too comfortable abroad to still count as one of their own. She spent a fair portion of her later life quietly trying to undo that decision, and it never fully worked in the way she wanted. Then, in 1942, something different happened. Barbara married Cary Grant. It's the one marriage most people still recognize by name, partly because Grant is the only husband on her list whose fame has outlasted the tabloids that covered him, and partly because it might genuinely have been the closest thing to a normal marriage she ever had. Grant reportedly never took money from her, not during the marriage and not after it. He was already wealthy in his own right, and already one of the biggest film stars in the country, which meant he had nothing to gain from her fortune, and, by most accounts, no interest in it. Friends said it was one of the only stretches of Barbara's adult life where photographs actually caught her looking happy, rather than merely photographed. Grant reportedly grew close to Lance during those years too, close enough that decades later, when Lance died, Grant was the one who helped arrange the funeral. But even that marriage ended, in 1945, not over cruelty and not over money, but over the far more ordinary friction of two people whose lives had simply stopped fitting the same shape. Grant was deep into building a film career. Barbara felt increasingly like an afterthought inside it. There's a story from the designer Oleg Cassini, a friend of Barbara's at the time, describing how Grant once pulled him aside during a rough patch in the marriage and asked him, almost pleadingly, to act as a kind of peacemaker between them, to reassure him there was nothing romantic between Cassini and Barbara, so he could trust him enough to intervene. Whatever Cassini did or didn't manage to smooth over, it wasn't enough. Barbara filed for divorce in 1945. Doris, meanwhile, was building an entirely different kind of marriage. In 1935, the same year Barbara married her count, Doris married James H.R. Cromwell, a twice-divorced political operator 16 years her senior, the son of a Palm Beach society doyen, and a man with clear ambitions that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a career he couldn't otherwise afford. He wasted no time putting her money to work. He ran, unsuccessfully, for the United States Senate from New Jersey, financing much of the campaign through her fortune while publicly positioning himself as a champion of ordinary working Americans, an irony that political columnists of the day didn't let pass quietly. He got himself appointed U.S. Minister to Canada in 1940, a diplomatic posting that put an ocean and a border between the couple for long stretches even before the marriage formally broke down. He used her fortune the way Barbara's husbands used theirs, just with better manners and an actual political strategy attached to it. In July 1940, Doris gave birth to a daughter, Arden, born prematurely. The baby lived less than 24 hours. Doctors told Doris she could never carry another pregnancy to term. She spent years afterward consulting mediums, trying to reach a daughter she had held for barely a day, and later biographical research based on phone records and telegrams from the period suggested the child's father may not even have been Cromwell. The marriage limped along a few more years before ending in 1943, and the divorce settlement took 5 additional years to resolve in court, because apparently even a split between two people with this much money couldn't be handled quickly. By the middle of the 1940s, both women had been married and divorced more than once. Both had lost or nearly lost a child, and both had become precisely the kind of tabloid fixture their fathers, in very different ways, had tried and failed to shield them from becoming. Whatever friendliness had existed between them as teenagers had curdled into something closer to a quiet, permanent competition, conducted mostly at a distance, through publicists, party invitations, and above all, through the annual best-dressed lists that both women reportedly treated as a running scoreboard. Doris, according to people who knew them both, resented that Barbara was widely considered the prettier one. Barbara, for her part, called Doris cheap, which inside their particular social world was one of the worst things you could say about a woman with that much money, because it implied she couldn't manage the one thing wealth was supposed to make effortless. Neither woman needed a manufactured reason to compete. They'd been handed one at birth, 8 days apart, by newspapers that had decided their fortunes made a far better story sitting side by side than either one would ever make alone. What neither of them saw coming was that their rivalry was about to acquire a face. A charming, chronically unemployed, endlessly recycled face, attached to a man who would eventually marry them both, ruin them both within roughly the same span of time, and somehow walk away from each divorce considerably richer than he'd walked in. His name was Porfirio Rubirosa. His official job title was Dominican diplomat. In practice, he was something closer to a professional husband, a man whose real career, whatever the passport said, was marrying, nearly marrying, or otherwise attaching himself to women whose net worth outstripped his own by several orders of magnitude. He'd started out as the son-in-law of Rafael Trujillo, the Dominican Republic's dictator, married to Trujillo's daughter Flor de Oro from 1932 until 1937, a connection that also fed persistent rumors over the years that Rubirosa had done darker work for the regime, beyond attending state dinners, including whispered accusations, never proven in any court, that he'd operated as something close to an enforcer for Trujillo's government during his years of closest access to the family. He held diplomatic postings in several countries during this period, though the actual diplomatic work appears to have been secondary to the access and cover those postings provided him. After Flor de Oro came the French film star Daniel Darrieux, married in 1942. Along the way he raced cars competitively, played polo at a genuinely elite level, and was later named as the co-respondent in George Sanders's divorce from Zsa Zsa Gabor, a scandal he treated with roughly the same shrug he treated most scandals. By every account from people who spent time around him, he had a rare gift for making rich, guarded, frequently disappointed women feel like the only person in any room, right up until the moment he didn't. Doris met him in Paris in 1945. She was working there at the time, first as a journalist for the International News Service, later briefly for Harper's Bazaar. She was 33 years old, twice divorced in effect, if not yet on paper, and still grieving a daughter she had held for a single day 5 years earlier. He was 36, freshly separated from Daniel Darrieux, and looking, as he generally was, for his next arrangement. The attraction moved fast, and by nearly every account, was entirely physical, rather than anything either of them dressed up as romance. They married in Paris on September 1st, 1947. Doris's fortune was large enough that the United States government reportedly assisted in drafting the prenuptial agreement before the wedding took place, which tells you something both about the scale of the money involved and about how seriously people around her took the risk of handing that much of it to Porfirio Rubirosa. He, for his part, apparently had no real idea just how wealthy she was until the negotiations began. He found out quickly, and by most accounts he adjusted his expectations accordingly. The marriage lasted a little over a year. It came apart in 1948, and the exact reasons depend on which friend's account you trust, but the overall shape is consistent across nearly every version. Rubirosa kept up contact, and reportedly more than contact, with Flor de Oro even while married to Doris, kept behaving like a man for whom marriage functioned as a status update rather than a commitment, and Doris, who had inherited from her father exactly one piece of advice above all others, eventually decided she'd trusted the wrong person yet again. What makes the divorce worth remembering isn't really the breakup itself, it's the settlement. Doris gave Rubirosa sports cars. She gave him polo ponies. She gave him a plantation back in his home country, in the Dominican Republic. She gave him a converted B-25 bomber, a genuine former United States Army Air Forces aircraft, refitted for his private use, because a normal private plane apparently wasn't going to be sufficient. She gave him a 17th century house in Paris, and on top of all of it, she agreed to pay him $25,000 a year for the rest of his life. As one final touch, she reportedly paid Danielle Darrieux, his most recent ex-wife, a full $1 million, simply to finalize her own divorce from him, cleanly and without complication, so that Doris's marriage could proceed unobstructed. It's the kind of settlement that sounds exaggerated until you check it against multiple sources, and it holds up every time. People who knew Doris well said she never fully got over him. She never remarried. Not to Rubirosa, and not to anyone else. Not once in the remaining 45 years of her life. 2 marriages, 1 lost infant daughter, and after 1951 she simply stopped trying the institution of marriage altogether, choosing instead to pour her energy into restoring historic properties, collecting art, and keeping the rest of the world at a distance she controlled with increasing precision as the decades went on. We're a little past the halfway mark, and this is exactly where the story turns, because the man who just cost one heiress a small fortune in parting gifts is about to walk straight into the arms of her oldest rival. If you want to see how these 2 women's lives finally collide for good, stay with us. And if you're finding this one interesting, drop a comment telling us which of these husbands you think was the worst of the entire bunch. We genuinely read them. Barbara Hutton met Porfirio Rubirosa in Paris, the same city where Doris had lost him 5 years earlier. By 1953, Barbara was heading into husband number 5 if you were counting from M. Divani onward, and she'd developed, whether consciously or not, a well-documented habit of wanting the exact things her rival had already claimed and lost. Doris had married Rubirosa. Doris had lost him. And now here was Barbara, gliding toward the altar with the identical man. When word reached Doris that her old rival was marrying Rubirosa, she didn't hold back. "She always wanted what I have," Doris reportedly said. And whatever else you think of either of these 2 women, that single line lands with the precision of someone keeping score since roughly 1930. The wedding took place on December 30th, 1953, in Paris. It did not go well, and it did not go long. Most tellings put the marriage somewhere between 53 days and a few months before it collapsed, with the divorce formally finalized in 1954. Rubirosa reportedly kept up his relationship with Zsa Zsa Gabor throughout the marriage, which meant Barbara spent her 5th trip down the aisle, watching essentially the same script play out that had ended Doris's 2nd marriage, just compressed into a shorter runtime and with a different mistress attached. The settlement followed a nearly identical pattern, just scaled up to match Barbara's particular taste for excess. She gave him $3.5 million. She gave him another converted B-25 bomber, because that detail, somehow, had become something close to a signature parting gift for this one specific man, regardless of which heiress happened to be signing the check. 2 of the richest women alive, 2 failed marriages to the same husband, 2 decommissioned military aircraft handed over on the way out the door. It's the kind of detail that sounds invented right up until you check it against the record twice, and it holds up both times. By the time the dust settled, Rubirosa had been married to both of the so-called gold dust twins, had extracted a fortune from each of them, and had accomplished it in barely more combined time than most ordinary couples spend planning a single wedding. He went on to marry a 5th and final time, to the French actress Odile Rodin in 1956, and he stayed married to her until his death in 1965, when he crashed a Ferrari at high speed in Paris after a night out, not long after playing in a polo match. It was, in its own way, exactly the kind of ending that suited the life. Fast, expensive, and finished before anyone had time to fully process it. For Doris and Barbara, though, the man himself mattered less over the long run than what he confirmed about the 2 of them together. He hadn't created their rivalry. He'd simply handed it a shared low point, One figure both women had trusted with a marriage and lost within roughly the same stretch of years, for roughly the same reasons, walking away roughly the same amount poorer for the experience. They stopped speaking to each other almost entirely after that. Years went by without contact. One story from that period has survived because it's almost too perfectly composed to be true, and yet it apparently is. Doris and a companion were dining at a restaurant in Tahiti when Barbara walked in. The two women sat across the room from one another for the entire meal without a single acknowledgement passing between them. A newspaper columnist covering the coincidence compared the two of them to China and the United States during the Cold War, fully aware of each other's existence, refusing all formal recognition of it. There's a second story, smaller but just as telling, from later in both their lives. Barbara, by then frail and struggling with her health, was met at a Los Angeles airport gate by an employee holding a wheelchair. Doris happened to be arriving at the same terminal that day. When the airline worker approached her with the chair by mistake, Doris reportedly snapped that he had the wrong woman, that she was Doris Duke, and that the other one was somewhere in Mexico. Even second-hand, even decades later, it's hard to read that exchange as anything other than exactly what it sounds like. Barbara's decline was the faster of the two, though calling anything about a 40-year unraveling fast feels almost dishonest. She married twice more after Rubirosa. Baron Gottfried von Cram, a German tennis champion and old friend from before their wedding, from 1955 to 1959, a marriage that started with more genuine promise than most of her others, and still ended, like all the rest, in divorce. And finally Prince Pierre Raymond d'Aune, a title Barbara essentially purchased for a man she'd met in Tangier, married in 1964, permanently separated by 1971. In between, she poured millions into building an enormous Japanese-style palace outside Cuernavaca, Mexico, called Sumia, meant as a gift for Dawn, complete with imported gardens and a private no-theatre, the kind of gesture that had become almost routine for her by that point in her life. 7 husbands total, across 4 decades. Only Cary Grant left her no poorer, in any real sense, than he'd found her. By the 1970s, Barbara was living in near-total isolation, dependent on alcohol and prescription medication, her weight dropping to a level that friends and staff around her described as visibly alarming, even by the standards of her earlier, thinner years. In 1972, her only child, Lance, died in a plane crash while scouting a location for an off-road race. She never recovered from the loss. She spent her final years nearly blind, largely confined to bed, living in a penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles, cared for almost entirely by hired staff, because there was very little family left to do it. She died there on May 11, 1979, of a heart attack, at 66 years old. Her bank account at the time held roughly $3,500. A woman who had once been among the richest people alive on the planet died with less money in the bank than the price of a used car. Doris outlived her by 14 years, and the more closely you look at how each of their stories ended, the smaller that gap becomes. In 1966, a full decade before Barbara's death, Doris was involved in an incident at Rough Point that never fully left her. She was driving home from a party with Edward Tirella, an interior decorator who had been doing work on the estate, when the car struck and killed him at the property's front gates. Accounts of exactly what happened differ, no charges were ever filed, and the story followed her quietly for the rest of her life anyway, whispered about at the same parties where she remained, at least on paper, the wealthier of the two so-called twins. She spent her later decades restoring historic houses, building one of the country's most significant private collections of Islamic art, and keeping an increasingly narrow circle of people around her, trusting fewer of them each year, which was in its own way the most literal possible way she could have honored her father's deathbed instruction from 1925. In 1988, she formally adopted a much younger woman named Chandy Hefner, whom she'd met 3 years earlier and felt an immediate maternal pull toward, only to disinherit her entirely by 1990, after the relationship soured. In her final years, Doris became dependent on a combination of antidepressants, painkillers, sleeping pills, and alcohol. After a fall in the early 1990s, she was confined to a hospital bed inside her own Los Angeles home, cut off from most of her old associates and friends, physically diminished to a degree that shocked people who remembered her as a commanding, athletic, nearly 6-foot presence in any room she chose to enter. In the days before she died, she rewrote her will one final time, naming her Irish butler as executor of an estate worth roughly $1.2 billion, a decision that triggered years of legal disputes after her death. She died on October 28, 1993, at 80 years old. Two women, born 8 days apart in the same city in 1912, dead 14 years apart on opposite ends of a rivalry, neither of them ever formally called off. Between them, across their lifetimes, 9 marriages, 1 shared husband, 2 military aircraft handed over as parting gifts, 1 lost infant daughter, 1 dead son, 1 dead companion at the front gates of a Newport mansion, and a combined fortune that, at its peak, could have purchased a small country outright, and, by the time both women were gone, hadn't been enough to keep either one of them from dying largely alone. Neither Doris Duke nor Barbara Hutton ever said, on the record, exactly what the other woman meant to her. There may not have been a clean answer available even to them. They'd been compared since birth, dressed for the same debutante season, married into the same narrow circuit of aristocrats and playboys, and handed, years apart but somehow inevitably, the very same disappointing husband. Friend, rival, mirror, warning, whatever the right word is, it outlasted every single marriage either of them ever entered, and in the end it may be the only relationship either woman actually kept for life. There's a photograph from that August night at Rough Point in 1930, both of them barely 18, standing a polite few feet apart in borrowed finery, with no idea yet what the next 5 decades had waiting for either of them. 9 marriages between them, 1 husband in common, and somehow, through all of it, the other woman was the one constant neither of them ever managed to shake. If this is the kind of story you come here for, women with more money than the world knew what to do with, managed, mismanaged, and occasionally ruined by the men circling all of it, we've got a full backlog of these on the channel already. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Tell us in the comments which of the 2 women you'd rather have been, and we'll see you in the next one.